Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third week of Fishtrap's 2022 NEA Big Read as we celebrate The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. Tonight, we have a special event that might help you look at The House on Mango Street in a different light. It's titled Reading Like a Writer, and it's with our longtime Fishtrap friend, Eliot Treichel. Rather than simply focusing on the novel's story or themes, Eliot will discuss what it means to read like a writer, and then look at some of the writing choices Cisneros employs in her work, all with the goal of improving our own storytelling craft. If you're watching this live via Zoom, you'll have a chance to connect and ask questions afterwards via the Zoom chat feature. And if you're watching the recording later on, make sure to take in all the Big Read events at fishtrap.org. A couple things before we get going. If this Big Read business is all new to you, it's a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. The NEA Big Read helps to broaden our understanding of the world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of sharing a good book together. I also want to thank this year's Big Read sponsors and funders, the Oregon Arts Commission, Pacific Power, Community Bank, and the Book Loft, our local bookstore. And what's really exciting is how Fishtrap has also partnered with other organizations to bring the Big Read to even more people in more places. They include Art Center East and the Cook Memorial Library in La Grande, Eastern Oregon University, the Historic Union Community Hall, Mama.Film, and the Wichita Public Library. Okay, let's get to the program. Eliot Treichel is the author of the story collection Closest Find, which received the Wisconsin Library Association Literary Award. Yeah, it's a great book. His young adult novel, A Series of Small Maneuvers, received both the Oregon Book Award, Reader's Choice Award, and the Reading the West Award. Originally from Wisconsin, he now lives on the dry side of Washington, where he is a member of the English faculty at Yakima Valley College. Please welcome Eliot Treichel. Take it away, Eliot.
Cool. Thanks so much for that intro, Mike. And thanks for everyone who showed up and is going to spend some time listening to what I have to say about one of my favorite novels. I will talk a little bit about the book and some things I noticed. And then, like as Mike said, hopefully there'll be some time at the end for a little bit of a conversation. I'm not a huge fan of PowerPoints or slideshows, but I did make one because I thought it would just be a little bit easier for us to all look at specific passages together or paragraphs rather than all of us flipping through our books individually. So with that being said, I guess I'm just going to get to it and share my screen. There is a chat feature and the raise your hand thing. So if you have questions while this is going on and you just want to throw them in there, that's fine. And we can get to them towards the end. All right, so I thought I would just start off a little bit by talking about what we mean when we say reading like a writer. So as I go along, I'm just going to make the presumption that all of us have read the book and also maybe have even checked out Shannon's interview with Sandra Cisneros, because I'll reference a few things there. But if you haven't read the book or seen that interview, you should be fine. And I'm kind of assuming that most of us have heard the expression reading like a writer, but in its basic way, we can read with a variety of agendas or with our attention focused on certain things. So one way to read is simply just reading for what happens in a novel or a story and following the characters along, or reading for entertainment. But there's another way to read, which is essentially just shifting our focus. And so reading like a writer means looking at the choices that an author has made in their text, trying to identify them and see the implications and the impacts of those choices, all with the goal really of becoming better writers ourselves, and then thinking about how we might use those choices or our understanding of those choices to kind of build the tools in our toolbox. So when we face similar choices in our own writing, we have some different ways of thinking about navigating those things. Before I start off, Mike mentioned I do teach at Yakima Valley College, which is a Hispanic serving institution in Yakima, although I'm here just kind of speaking as myself and not on behalf of the college. I also want to address this part, which is when we think about writing craft, it's really maybe best to think of craft as a set of expectations. And this comes from the writer Matthew Salesses. Of course, expectations are not universal. Our expectations are dependent upon the culture we belong to and have grown up in, where we live, our identities. Those all impact what we think of as stories. And so, you know, my being a white guy who speaks mostly English, who grew up in northern Wisconsin and now lives in Washington, impacts what I notice out of this book and how I relate to it. So my talk tonight is really just what one writer, me, noticed as he read and thought about what a story is and should be. But it's not the correct take or the most definitive take. And other writers or readers from different cultures or of different genders or identities are going to notice other things. And so I just kind of want to throw that out there right now. All right, so if we begin just thinking about this wonderful novel, The House on Manga Street, and some of the choices that Sandra Cisneros makes, the ones that kind of stick out right away are the ways that she plays with form or pushes back against form in some ways. And most often, The House on Manga Street is described as a novel told in a series of vignettes or these sort of brief moments of description. We could consider those chapters as well. There are 44 of them. They all have titles to them, although they're not numbered. The longest are about 4 pages. Most of those 44 chapters are 1 or 2 pages, and then there's a few that are just a half a page or so. So that right away we can start thinking about what is the impact of that. For some, it makes for a more lively reading experience or something that they enjoy. For other readers, it might not necessarily be off-putting, but a little bit harder for them to get into. And so when we think about who we are as readers, we should think about what are our expectations or our assumptions about what novels or poems or short stories should or can be. And so someone who's, you know, mostly read, like, for instance, Tom Clancy novels is going to react to this book differently than someone who only reads poetry or short stories or other kinds of books. I sat in on an earlier part of these Big Read events, and it was a little bit of a talk after Shannon's interview with Sandra Cisneros, and some of the participants were talking about various book clubs they were in and people's reactions, and those reactions, you know, ran the gamut. There was some members of the book club who actually absolutely adored this book, and there were others who didn't really like it very much, or, you know, didn't do it for them, and those are all legitimate. But I guess the other thing I would want to say for us as we're thinking about reading like a writer is that, you know, as writers, what are our expectations and assumptions about what novels, poems, or short stories should or can be? And so those might influence what we're able to write or how we approach writing. So I think the more we can expand all those things, the better off we are. And I think, like, maybe I would answer this question as that it is both D and E. It is none of these things and it is all of these things at the same time. So as we kind of get into the book a little bit more, I'm going to focus on maybe what I would call like big picture stuff, plot, character, that sort of thing, and then move into sentence level items and that kind of stuff. So, you know, like, what is the effect of Sandra Cisneros' choice to present her book in this way with these short vignettes? I think one important thing for us to think about is that a book is always giving us instructions about how it wants to be read. And sometimes that takes a while to figure out those instructions, but, you know, a book that is has numbered chapters, is giving the reader certain instructions about how it's meant to be read. It's meant to be read from, the beginning number 1 to the end in a chronological order. However, this book, which has chapters that can be read chronologically or just randomly, they can be looked at individually or taken collectively as a whole, is definitely giving its readers a different set of instructions for how it wants to be read. And so it's important to think about those and really coming to a text on its own terms, both as a reader and as a writer. I wanted to pull out this paragraph from the introduction of this 20th anniversary edition. I think it's 25th anniversary edition, where Sandra Cisneros talks a little bit about her journey of becoming a writer and writing this book. And it's a really interesting piece because of the way she moves through writing about herself in third person and then sometimes first person. But this paragraph really stuck out to me about what she was trying to do with this book. And I put it up on the screen because some of what's on here is really going to inform what I talk about and how I talk about it. So you'll see some of these things coming up. So creating a text that is as succinct and flexible as poetry, snapping sentences into fragments so that the reader pauses, making each sentence serve her and not the other way around. So the sentence is serving the writer, abandoning quotation marks to streamline the typography, making the pages as simple and readable as possible. So, and then sentences as pliable as branches and can be read in more ways than one. So keep that in mind as I move forward and start showing you a few things. For me as a writer, and any book I read, I'm always interested in the first line and what the writer is trying to do with that. We can think about the beginning of books and novels and short stories in many ways, but it is really kind of maybe presenting a question that the rest of the novel is going to answer. But what stands out to me about the first line of House on Manga Street is how much work is being done in just these 7 words. So a very simple sentence, but we have a cast of characters established with the use of we. So there's the narrator plus some other people. And then there's this part, didn't always live on Mango Street. And so with that, right away, we get the sense that there's something has happened, right? Something's changed. So she's already establishing sort of a story before the story. Another writer might then spend the rest of the book talking about what it was that happened that brought them to Mango Street or what changed. Sandra Cisneros doesn't do that though. And she takes a different approach. We could look at the plot of this book, and it probably could be argued by some that this is a novel without a plot. But again, that really depends on how you define the plot. Excuse me. So I don't want to use the word traditional. So this is, again, where culture and expectations come in. So maybe the Western idea of plot is that plot is a series of actions that have consequences to them. And so the famous example is the king died and then the queen died of grief. However, there are other ways to think about plot. And one of those is that plot is the acceptance or rejection of consequences, which is a little bit different than, a whodunit. And so if we think about plot that way, I do think there is a plot to this novel. And as we watch the character of Esperanza grow and develop from a young girl moving towards adulthood, we see her begin to accept or reject certain consequences of the world around her. So she thinks about the culture she belongs to and what things like getting married mean. and what a woman's place is. And then sometimes she accepts those and others she pushes back. So what does this mean for us? I guess as writers, I'm someone who struggles with plot. And so when I think about, do I need to write a book that adheres to the Western model of plot? Here's clearly an example that I don't, and I can play around with things in other ways. Another thing that stands out to me about this book as I was reading through it again is the choices that Cisneros makes in terms of narrator and point of view in the characters. So we have a narrator to this book. It's Esperanza. She's both the narrator of the novel, but at other times she's a character within it. The point of view is mostly first person, as like this example here. I haven't inherited her name. Usually it's first person singular. Other times it's first person plural, like the we from the first line. In many of the little vignettes or chapters, Esperanza is an active participant in the events that are happening. Sometimes she's a little bit more removed and is mostly an observer of the events. But then there are other chapters where Cisneros kind of switches to third person, and Esperanza isn't really there at all. So there's a couple of vignettes. Alicia, who sees mice, and Geraldo, no last name, are both examples where Esperanza isn't there. It's almost told in a third person with various degrees of like omniscience and being in the characters' heads. At the same time, though, even though those are kind of third person vignettes, it does seem like Esperanza is always kind of there guiding us through these moments. So again, it just really, as writers, what does that mean for us? It tells us that we can play around with point of view, and that maybe some of the rules we've been told about consistency with point of view aren't as rigid as we have thought about before. So when first person serves us, Cisneros shows us how to maximize it. And then in other parts, when it doesn't, she shows us how to switch. And it allows her to sort of shift emphasis, right? So we're not emphasizing Esperanza in some of those those chapters, but we get emphasis on other people and what's happening to them. So if you think back to the paragraph from the introduction, where she talked about making sentences as pliable as branches, I think also Cisneros makes these other functions of craft pliable as branches, right? So she plays around with point of view and uses it to serve her and not the other way around, and even things like plot as well. All right, so to kind of move in and get a little bit smaller, I want to look at a few sentences and some things that Cisneros does consistently throughout the novel. So one thing is that there are a lot of sentence fragments in this book that kind of help with the rhythm. Sometimes there are a sentence fragment here, like the sentence, a real house. Other times there are sentence fragments because Cisneros repeatedly begins sentences with the coordinating conjunction but or and. So here's an example where both of those things are happening. I knew then I had to have a house, a real house, one I could point to, but this isn't it. The house on Manga Street isn't it. For the time being, Mama says, temporary, says Papa, but I know how those things go. And I pulled this particular group of sentences out because another thing is happening here that shows up several times throughout the novel, and that's where Cisneros is kind of using these mirrored sentences. Sometimes they're sentences that are almost exactly the same, but have some different things in them. Or there's like this example here where she has, for the time being, Mama says, temporary, says Papa. And so Mama says and says Papa are kind of mirrored. And a different writer might not have done that and simply said, for the time being, Mama says, temporary, Papa says. That's not wrong in any, sense of things, but I think this is better. So, but it's really subtle. And again, if you're just reading for action and plot, some of these things might go unnoticed. And not to belabor this point or this slide, but thinking back to the interview that Shannon did with Sandra Cisneros, one of the first things that she said was that she said, many people are kind of surprised by my voice and they don't expect it being what it is. And then she said, it's kind of like, she realized it was her Trojan horse. And so with her voice, she was able to maybe say some things and slip some things in that other louder, maybe more bombastic voice wouldn't be able to do. And so I was thinking about this novel, and I think there's these moments throughout where there is kind of this Trojan horse things where she just slips things in very quietly and subtly. And if you're not paying attention, you might miss them. So again, here's more examples of these sentence fragments, particularly though the moments where she's using coordinating conjunctions to start sentences. And I put this header up on the screen because the students I work with, I ask them a lot about the conceptions they have about writing and what they're bringing to their classes, to our class. And a lot of them will talk about the rules that they've sort of been told in high school classes or other classes, and the ways they've been maybe punished for the grammar, the type of grammar they use, or the languaging choices that they've made. And so I certainly know when I was in high school, I was told never start a sentence with and or but. I know that rule is maybe not as strict as it once was, but here again is just a way to think about how we can play with some of the, I guess, Western conventions, or what we might call the habits of white language in some ways. In addition to those things, one thing that kind of showed up for me on the second reading this time was how much rhyme there is in this book. And there's also this beautiful rhythm and music to the whole novel. So here's an example of a sentence that has both rhyme and rhythm. Again, this is actually a sentence fragment. It's not a grammatically correct, complete sentence. It's a sentence fragment. Only a house quiet as snow, a space for myself to go, clean as paper before the poem. So we have, a couple different, we have the rhyme of snow and go. There's also quiet as snow, myself to go, the same number of syllables there. We have the sentence that has these sort of three, it's kind of like a triptych. There's these three parts. And the first one is 8 syllables, the middle is 7, and then the last one is 8 syllables as well. And I don't know, I don't know if she intentionally counted out her syllables or anything like that, but I wouldn't doubt it. It does create a certain effect that would be achieved if, she made a different choice, like writing a grammatically correct sentence and that sort of thing. There are other ways that she achieves kind of rhythm to her writing. Sometimes she uses repetition as a mechanism for rhythm or to emphasize certain things. I guess unlike certain types of poetry, though, which are maybe most interested in sound or some surrealistic poetry and that sort of thing, this is a very poetic passage, but she's still always revealing characters in her lines. So here again, we have repetition, no speak English, no speak English, no, no, no. But we have the rhyme of bubble into tears, can't believe her ears. So this is kind of beginning to put all these different pieces together. There's also, I think, this beautiful line to the child who's singing in the language that sounds like tin. And I'll talk about Cisneros' use of simile in a second here. There's this one other way that I noticed multiple times throughout the novel. Cisneros is working towards rhythm. It's not necessarily through rhyme, and it's in some ways, sentence fragments, but it's really playing around with syntax. And so here's an example of this. Sire, how did you hold her? Was it like this? And when you kissed her, like this? Again, we just kind of slowing that moment down by breaking it up that way. We get that lilting sort of sing-song part to it and the inflection of the questions. Again, when I'm looking at the choices that an author makes in their work, part of what I'm always asking myself is what would be a different choice, and how would that play out, and what would the impacts be, to really kind of understand the impacts of these choices. So this passage would be entirely different if she had combined "was it like this" together into one sort of question. There's other moments like this. I think I have some slides that point it out. Here's one, I think, that kind of brings all these things that we've been talking about so far together in one couple sentences here. We have repetition, we have this rhyme, we have these sentence fragments. And this is one of the more powerful chapters to me from this book. And then finally, here's one last example. And this is, I think, my favorite chapter of the book, Darius, who looks at clouds. Here we have, who doesn't like school is sometimes stupid and mostly a fool. We have that rhyme there. We have this other kind of rhyme. The second example there, you all see that cloud, that fat one there, Darius said, see that where? That's almost Dr. Seussian. That one there, see that, that's God, Darius said. God, someone little asked. God, he said, and made it simple. Really beautiful. This is another example of where, Esperanza isn't necessarily there as part of the action, but she's kind of guiding us through this experience. Okay. There are, you can see quite a few examples on this slide. There are so many wonderful lines in this book. And one thing that Cisneros is constantly doing is using simile. And so, a simile is really, it's a metaphor, but it's really asking us to make an explicit comparison. So what stands out to me about her use of simile just is how many there are throughout the novel. So if you'll notice, I can't quite see the bottom of my screen here, but there's a number of similes here. This is just from like 20 pages of the book though, but the whole thing is peppered with these. And like what I was saying is what stands out to me is just how unexpected they are in some ways. They're slightly askew, but they're all very common things. Like, it's not specialized language. It's not a rare reference that most people wouldn't know. They fit kind of perfectly with the theme or what's happening in the chapter. But like, for example, not bitter like an empty room is such good writing to me, because I would never normally put those two things together, bitter and empty room, but it's, once I see it there, it's like the perfect piece of writing. The taxi door open like a waiter's arm is another just absolutely beautiful one. And then the ceiling smooth as wedding cake, again, that's one of those unexpected comparisons. However, it fits in perfectly with that chapter, which is about Sally getting married. and moving to a different state so she could get married early, and then kind of being trapped in this marriage and being home alone. And that's not a perfect relationship. So just wonderful, wonderful stuff. Beyond the use of simile, another thing that shows up repeatedly throughout this book is Cisneros uses these relative clauses. And so she uses relative pronouns to kind of reveal parts about characters. So my knowledge of grammar will only get us so far, and then there's other people who can name all of these things really, really well. But a relative clause is sometimes called an adjective clause because it's giving more information about the noun or the subject of the sentence. So here are a couple of them. They show up repeatedly throughout the book. And then you can see some of these, like the first one, Kathy's Queen of Cats, has cats and cats and cats, is also combining this use of repetition together, versus another writer who would just write, Kathy has a lot of cats. Here's one more example that I wanted to show you, and I wanted to show you this one for a couple of reasons. We have these relative clauses here: who wakes up tired in the dark, who combs his hair with water. These are all adding more information to the subject of the sentence, who is Papa. But if we look at the sentence, the independent clause of the sentence, like what makes it a complete sentence, is the stuff that's in blue. My Papa today is sitting on my bed. That's the complete sentence. And so in thinking about sentences as pliable as branches, here Cisneros, instead of kind of snapping things into fragments, pulls it apart and then pours in all this information that is really beautiful in a beautiful way. It's specific, it's tender. And so there's these moments in this book where she kind of breaks the pattern she's set up. And most often these come at very emotionally charged moments. So this is the chapter where her grandmother has died, her Papa's mom. And so we kind of slow things down. We get a little bit more. There's a sense of heaviness, I think, here in this passage. And there's also this sense of just how abnormal it is. So something's going on. Okay, so another thing, I don't think understatement is the right word for this, but I was hard pressed to figure out what is the right word. But two things are sort of tied together, and setting is a big part of this book, right? So we get the house on Manga Street and all these other characters around in the neighborhood. If we think about setting and place, I think especially, with Fishtrap, where we're clear thinking and good writing in about the West, a lot of times we would think about as like place as character or setting as a character, which is not, I wouldn't say it's wrong to think about it that way, but another way to think about setting is that it's not its own character, but it is really reliant on characters. Setting is an awareness of the world, and different people are going to notice different things. So in this case, we're really getting what Esperanza is noticing about the setting. Some of the things happening in the book are there's violence, the misogyny, some dark stuff happening, but she makes these choices to sort of slip it in there without a lot of commentary. And so both of these examples come at the very end of a chapter. This is the tree we chose for the first annual Tarzan jumping contest. Maybe won and broke both arms, and then that's it. Like no no going on about the broken arms. She doesn't come back to the broken arms. We don't have a moment where the casts are coming off or anything like that. So another writer, I think, maybe who is not quite as sure of themselves would spend a lot of time talking about these things and just kind of piling on with them. But here she makes an absolutely different choice. And here's another example of it. And you can see that we have all these different pieces that I'm talking about coming together, fragments, some longer sentences, but nobody looked up, not once the day Angel Vargas learned to fly and dropped from the sky like a sugar donut, just falling like a star. So more similes, and exploded down to earth without even an O. And that's the end of the chapter. And what's I think so perfect about it is, I would bet that every person, as they finished that sentence, said to themselves, oh, right? Like, oh my God. There are other kind of moments like this where slightly different understatement, but she just kind of slips some things in. And I love this. We must be Christmas. Again, we have Esperanza kind of developing more knowledge of the world and herself and how things work. And again, she just has this beautiful line, we must be Christmas. All right, so here's, not to belabor this, but here's another example of it with this last line, like, and fathers. However, I pulled this out because there's another thing that Cisneros does a few times through the book where she does snap things into fragments and she just kind of cuts off the subject of the sentence. She establishes the sentence like early in the vignette, and then the sentence that follows, the subject is cut off like grammatically. So this chapter starts off, Alicia, whose mama died, is sorry, and then it goes on. And then we have this repetition of is. So again, another writer may have written, Alicia is a good girl. She is my friend who studies all night. But here Cisneros makes a different point, and we get that repetition of is a good girl, is afraid of nothing except four-legged fur and fathers. And that putting fathers as its own sentence is another way to slow the reader down, to make them consider what she's saying and really add emphasis to this part. Here's one more example. I won't belabor it, but we get both. We get this moment where she's cutting off the subject, and we get this repetition of is. So for me, as I'm reading like a writer, we start to see the patterns that an author is doing within their text. We're getting these kind of instructions about how we should be reading. So I'm really trying to pay attention to any moment where the author breaks the patterns that they set up or things dramatically change. And so there are a few moments throughout this novel where we, instead of having very short fragmented sentences, we get these kind of long sprawling sentences. Some are run-on sentences in grammatical terms, some are just long and flowing. And so whenever that happens, I really want to pay attention. So I just, here's an example of it in the preceding, I believe it's a baptism party, if I'm remembering things correctly, but in the preceding paragraph, Esperanza's cousin by first communion tries to get her to dance, and she's like, nope, not going to do it. She's locked in her chair. She talks about her feet are getting bigger and bigger. And then this paragraph comes in, and I just want to read this one because it's so beautiful to me. Then Uncle Nacho is pulling and pulling my arm, and it doesn't matter how new the dress Mama bought is, because my feet are ugly until my uncle, who is a liar, says, you are the prettiest girl here. And yes, we are dancing, my Uncle Nacho and me, only I don't want to at first. My feet swell big and heavy like plungers, but I drag them across the linoleum floor, straight center, where Uncle wants to show off the new dance we learn. and uncle spins me, and my skinny arms bend the way he taught me, and my mother watches, and my little cousins watch, and the boy who was my cousin by first communion watches, and everyone says, wow, who are those two dancing in the movies, until I forget that I'm wearing only ordinary shoes, excuse me, brown and white, the kind my mother buys each year for school. So that's such beautiful writing to me, in part because of how flowing it is and how she pulls us in. And in many ways, the writing is dancing. And then we have just this wonderful simile, my feet swell big and heavy like plungers. So good. Okay, to begin pulling all this together, we'll look at the ending of the book. So again, another writer would approach things very differently. Here we're back to Esperanza being the narrator and the character. And this is the last chapter. And she says, I like to tell stories. I am going to tell you a story about a girl who didn't belong. So at the end of this book, after she has told us the story, she then goes on to say, I am going to tell you a story, which is kind of a really interesting move. And what does it mean? Well, again, if we think about the Western structure of a novel, you know, that we would be told that it needs a beginning, middle, and end. It starts off with exposition. We have some sort of rising action. There's conflict, and then there's resolution of that conflict. And we don't really have that in this book. However, there does seem to be kind of a pyramid shape to it, where in the beginning, the chapters are usually quite short. Then they tend to get a little bit longer right in the middle, and then they get short again. And there's kind of a tone shift to these chapters as well. So in the beginning, they're a little bit more lighthearted or innocent. They reminded me of sort of a kid who is kind of like poking her head out and you know, being funny, and then kind of hiding, you know, sort of like a shy kid hiding. And then in the middle, the chapters start to get a little bit longer. Here we have Esperanza kind of understanding her sexuality and her body and the world around her in new ways. Hips kind of comes right in the very middle of this book. And then following that is the chapter about her first job, where the one person who befriends her then forces himself on her. And then we have the shrinking of chapters in the end, but the tone of those chapters in the end isn't quite as lighthearted as they were in the beginning. And then we have the longest chapters. The monkey garden comes very near the end and breaks this pattern. But again, here's another example where she just kind of slips something in without commentary and said, this is where I wanted to die and where I tried one day, but not even the monkey garden would have me. And you could read that sentence in many ways, you know, metaphorically or literally, but one way is that, you know, she is commenting on wanting to die in a sort of very literal way in that chapter. And then finally, in thinking about these things and structure, this is at the end of the second to last chapter. You must remember to come back for the others, the circle, understand. And I thought I pulled that out because to me, this really is a circular narrative where we start someplace and then kind of end back at the beginning, right? She says, I am going to tell you a story. So we're kind of at the beginning again, but having gone through that journey, we're not at the same place, we're at a different place. You know, and a circle can go one way or the other. And so those are the things that stood out to me as a writer, that I saw consistently throughout, that were kind of picking at my brain. Come back to me in a week, and if I read this book one more time, I may have focused on a few other things. Hopefully that helps you think about the books in a slightly different way and gives you some tools to consider. And mostly I hope I just didn't sound like a babbling idiot. All right, so if anyone has questions, let me know.
Yeah, Eliot, thank you so much. You made me think about this book in a different way. And all of you out there in the crowd, if you know folks who are working at their writing craft and would benefit from looking at just thinking about it in a different way, or classrooms, college level, elementary, high school. If your writing group would benefit from this, please share it. We'll have the recording up on the site starting tomorrow, and you could share it with anybody. Early on in this, Cam Scott came in and had a question. Eliot, what do you think about the idea of constellation or lyrical web instead of a plot? Maybe we get Cam to comment more on this. In a book of poetry, the lyrical nature of the constellation of the overall poem arc all speaks, but individual poems can be pulled. Maybe a music album too. The House on Manga Street felt most to me like a lyrical constellation in this way. Nicely done, Cam. Eliot?
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. And thinking about plot, there's so many different ways to approach it. Again, when we think about the, craft as a set of expectations, which was at the beginning, if we just have a broader set of expectations, we can do different things. But yeah, I didn't, you're the poet, Cam, and so you think about things a little bit differently. And I love the phrase constellation. But yeah, certainly, I mean, you can, I'm thinking about like certain novels or short stories that just repeat a line, right? Like they kind of start each section with the same line over and over again, but they amplify in different ways or focus on different things. And so certainly.
Great. Leanna Torres just made a comment. Great talk, Eliot. Thank you. As much as I love this book, I often wonder how editors and publishers look at this book as it is. How many times was it rejected in this form? It just shows you never know what books will become masterpieces.
I really enjoyed the interview that Shannon did with Sandra Cisneros, and she talked a little bit about the tiny press that this was first published on and what it's grown up to be and how many rejections it's gotten. And the other thing that stood out to me was someone from a school asked her a question about maybe ending or quitting, and she sort of said, no, I'm not. I'm 67 and I'm just figuring out what I'm doing, and I'm just getting going. And that gave me a kick in the pants that I needed, because I'm definitely struggling finding publication of certain things right now, but just trying to remember. Yeah. But I do also think that this book, like it's not for everyone, or it takes maybe a couple of readings to see how wonderful it is. It's not sorry, I'm just going to start rambling here, so shut me up at some point. But to think of Cam's point about a music album, the heavy pop album, like you're jamming with it right away. You got it. Other albums, it takes a few listens to really realize what's there and how much is there, the understated things and that sort of thing. So
Shannon asks a great question about how do teach, and this is to everyone, but also Eliot and Cam and any of you other educators out there, how do teachers of writing talk about or describe this book to young or experienced writers? How are some ways that you have described this book? Because I know, Eliot, you're a fan.
Yeah, I'll defer to others. Maybe I've actually never taught this book in the class. I've looked at individual pieces, and I've taught essays by Sandra Cisneros, where she sort of talks about herself being a writer.
Teaching this book was so freeing for me as a teacher, because I guess once I laid out, the students started off with a research project, and one of the things they researched were how many people did not like the book. And so the students were coming in very like, we're not going to like it at all. And then, after a couple of the vignettes, they were really in love with the book. And I think it's a really nice piece of writing if you love form. And so I did a lot of, focusing on figurative language, just like Eliot did. I mean, Eliot is such a great presentation. Thank you. And just those things that Eliot focused on, when students start catching those, I feel like they become better writers, and their ear changes. You're listening to a new kind of music. I'm curious about Eliot unpacking the line about I forget what you called it, Eliot, but something about like the kind of the Western white language, I guess, that we get shoved through with. But I really think that the wonderful thing about figurative language and breaking language apart is that you start to hear voices. I love it for student voice. I just love it for student voice.
Shannon adds, what did the kids in your classroom love about the book? Just curious, what resonated with them?
Well, I guess the coolest thing was, after the first couple of vignettes, I cut them free, and they had an assignment where they read their own 5 vignettes to show them that they could pick up any part of the book anywhere. And literature is so amazing, and they loved that they could pick up their own vignettes. There was a sense of ownership there, and a lot of the students picked up vignettes that they needed to hear, if that makes sense, or that were impactful for their lives, maybe things that they'd gone through without any prompting, I guess. And so they really loved that sense of sorry, my dogs are running rampant. They love the sense of ownership and being able to immerse in a book differently, where a typical novel, it's point A to point B, and you have 250 pages of sometimes super hard things to get there. Where here they wrote vignettes. They could do what Sandra was doing.
Accessible. Yeah.
Jill, what were you going to say?
Hi, my name is Jill Gibby, and I teach at Eastern Oregon University. I teach Spanish, and I teach this book in the context of a Chicano literature class, and so I was really interested in your talk, and I hope it'll be available next year when I teach my class again, so that I could share that. I teach this book usually after looking at a book by Tomas Rivera called "And the Earth Did Not Swallow Me," or there's two translations. We read that book in Spanish, and then we read this book in English. They're both books structured like vignettes, but the book by Rivera has a male narrator, and this one a female narrator. You didn't talk about gender issues at all in your talk, and I just wondered, I'm really happy to hear that you and Cameron are so appreciative of this book, reading it from a different perspective, and I wondered if you might talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the beginning, part of what I tried to say is, I'm a white guy from Wisconsin and lives in Washington now, so that impacts what I notice in the book and what I feel comfortable commenting on as well. But certainly, and then partly the talk also being more about writing choices than necessarily like thematic interpretation or using the lens of like gender studies or Chicano studies to look at this book. But I would wonder if, Cam's point about, researching how many people don't like the book, what the results would be and how they would fall along gender lines. But I mean, I tend to read male authors, although I really try to make a conscious effort to read women writers as much as possible. So I think that's a way of not answering your question. Not trying to not answer it, but I don't know that I have a good answer.
Right.
Jill,
Well,
Jill, what do you do? What do you do in your classes? Do you find that there's I mean, it's such a rich book, right?
yeah. I do different things, and as I said, I do have them read it in English, but now that the Spanish version has been circulated, I'll probably do more with that. And I wish that I had that with me, because I would have liked to look up some of the comments that Eliot made to see how it translated into, like the use of the relative clause. So I'm going to go back and look at that and see if the translator carried through. I suspect that she did, but it'd be interesting to see, how she, how well she did with all the rhythm and everything else that you pointed out. So, yeah, sometimes I have students act out different, vignettes, and I definitely like to use them as springboards for their own writing as well, just for fun. And as I said, the course is conducted in Spanish and they write in Spanish, but that book we do read in English generally.
Hi, Jill, this is Shannon. When I both did the research before I did the interview with Sandra Cisneros, and then we did the conversation the other day with the group. This is my observation, but I found that the folks that struggled with some of the misogyny that was discussed in the book,
Yeah.
and saw that it was interesting. We were just talking about it before, that there was a perception from some of our male participants that the book was negative and the book was dark, and that it was a downer. And I'm curious, since you're teaching the book to, potentially to people who are Spanish speakers, if there's a take on that part of the book, it's different, coming from, a gendered perspective, because my experience of the book was that it was anything but negative. I thought it was very accurate, a portrayal of realizing what the world is like as a young woman as you grow up. But it was interesting to hear that observation that, it was negative and it was dark and it was, that it was a negative thing. So I'm just curious about what you're seeing with your students.
Right. So in teaching these two books together, they're both considered Bildungsromans, so books about the education and the development of the characters. And so the book by Rivera is about a migrant worker, and so we have very much the migrant reality, and then the rural reality, and then this book is very much urban. I don't recall people focusing on that, in terms of that it's a negative. I always love to emphasize the chapters, and Eliot mentioned one of them, where, the bums in the attic. I love that chapter. And the chapter where she's talking about bringing things back to the community. I think that's one you highlighted, and how important it is to give back. So I guess I don't dwell on those other chapters as much, but I mean, some of them are definitely difficult. I mean, there's rape scenes and whatnot. And Cameron, what level do you teach?
I taught the book. I taught the book for 9th through 12th graders.
Yeah, so that must be hard. If you don't cut those scenes out, and
they discovered them on their own, and they also my student population has had a lot of similar experiences, I guess, and so there were less triggers there, and way more almost feeling like bolstering of voice. Like
nice.
Some of the students were like, I can say these things in this way.
Mm-hmm.
There's an empowerment, I guess.
Right. It gives them permission, and yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah. And where do you teach?
I teach in Wallowa, which is a school of about It's a town of about 800 people. It's a
Yeah,
school of like
I
80.
know Malawi. I know Malawi. Yeah, yeah. So, um, I'm sorry, Shannon. Did I answer your question? I don't remember.
Yeah, no,
any-
absolutely. Yeah. And I'm curious about, to bring it back to the writer's perspective too. Um, Eliot, you talked about her subtlety in her writing styles, how she portrayed those pieces, because from my perspective, again, I think we talked about this a little bit even in that discussion the other day, that there was no, it was very subtle. And, as you talk about, as you're looking at this as a writer or teaching this as from the writer's perspective, what was your viewpoint of how she depicted some of these really pretty intense experiences?
I mean, I think to me it shows, the sophistication of her writing, because I do think a younger, more inexperienced writer would belabor those things and really kind of give a lot of like maybe explicit description in the attempt of showing how horrible they are, right? But then there's something by doing so that gets kind of written out by like belaboring them or really focusing on it, where with her Cisneros, she just kind of slips them in, and because they're so understated, again, I don't know if that's the right word, they become that much more powerful because there's no commentary on them, and we begin to see like how commonplace they are. Because again, if we think about character as an awareness of surroundings, she's not like, oh my gosh, this has never happened before. It's just like, this happened and this happened again. Um, and I think it's this interesting pairing of how beautiful some of the writing is with how dark some of the things are. It is dark in parts. I don't know that I would not describe it as negative or unfair to men in any sort of way, shape, or form. It is just a realistic portrayal. But that pairing of the beauty of the lyricism with some of the events that are happening, I think makes it powerful. Again, it's one choice among many that she could have made. So.
Which is interesting because when she wrote the book, she was very young and inexperienced. So I think it speaks a lot to her craft and her talent. And also, much to your point, for a lot of women, that's just, it's a day with a Y in it. It's a normal experience. It's not something exceptional. Yeah.
Yeah, and also what she said, like in that interview with how being in graduate school, right, and anytime they spoke, like her and Joy Haro speaking, they were kind of silenced, either through no response or whatever. So I do, I think she was a very sophisticated writer at a very early age, and kind of realizing maybe some of the BS that was being taught in those workshops.
Well, there's a reason we're all seeing why this book has been a part of the literary landscape in schools, universities, and conversations for more than 30 years. We're just getting going. Cam and Jill, thank you so much for adding yours and all the work you put into this, Eliot. Once this recording goes up on YouTube, I am going to share this with the entire Big Read community around the country who are doing this book. It's such a valuable lesson, and it sure got all of us thinking. So thanks to all of you for joining. I want to share one last thing before we go. This weekend, hey, there's Eliot. Everybody can go and revisit some of at least the things that happened virtually. The salsa dance lessons. This weekend, we have partnered with Wichita Public Library on a Big Read Finale short film festival. And all you do is register here. It's free. And there are these short films based on the house on Mango Street from all over. There are some from Mexico. There are some from, they're just all over the place, but you can watch them anytime in the classroom or around the dinner table. So I just want to share that with everybody. Register for that if you can. And with that, I want to thank you all for carving out a Wednesday night and for being a part of this and participating in the Big Read. So.